Lightning split the Colorado sky as Nathaniel Reed tracked three silhouettes through the jagged canyon. Rain hammered his wide-brimmed Stetson, but his gaze never wavered from the hoof prints rapidly filling with muddy water. His Winchester Model 1873, the gun that won the West, rested comfortably against his shoulder, the walnut stock worn smooth from 15 years of hard use. Behind him, Frank Peterson and two ranch hands spread out in practice formation. The old foreman signaled with a low whistle, movement ahead where the canyon narrowed between sheer rock walls. In one fluid motion, Nathaniel dismounted from his stallion, raised the rifle to his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The 44-40 cartridge exploded with a crack that echoed between the stone walls. A man screamed in the distance, "That's close enough." "Reed," a voice called from behind a boulder. "Next one goes between your eyes." Nathaniel's weathered face remained impassive, though fury burned in his chest. These weren't random rustlers. They were Harrington's men. He'd recognized Jake Peterson's distinctive spur marks in the mud by the river crossing. "You're on Blackwater land, stealing Blackwater cattle," Nathaniel called back, voice cutting through the drumming rain. "Surrender now and the sheriff handles this. Keep shooting and they'll carry you back to Harrington in pine boxes." A bullet pinged off rock 6 inches from his head. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He worked the lever action smoothly, chambering another round, then sighted carefully and fired. Another scream echoed through the canyon. "Two down, one to go," Nathaniel called out, working the lever again. "What'll it be, boy?" The last rustler emerged, hands raised, barely 20 years old, with terror in his eyes. "Don't shoot! Harrington said it would be easy money. Said you wouldn't be watching this section with the drought pulling you south." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "Harrington's got a big mouth and small ideas. Tell him next time I won't aim for shoulders." As they rounded up the would-be thieves and recovered the stolen cattle, Frank rode up alongside his boss. At 65, the foreman had seen it all. Indian wars, gold rushes, and the slow taming of the frontier. He'd been with Nathaniel since the beginning, when a 19-year-old boy had inherited a burnt-out ranch and a mountain of debt. "Third raid this month," Frank observed, his voice gravelly from years of trail dust. "Harrington's getting bolder." Nathaniel scanned the horizon, watching storm clouds gather over his 15,000 acres. 15 years of sweat and blood had built Blackwater Ranch from the ashes of tragedy, and now drought threatened everything. The spring rains hadn't come, the creek was drying up, and Harrington, that vulture, was circling. "It's not just cattle he's after," Nathaniel said finally. "It's the water. It's always been about the water." Back at the ranch house, Nathaniel handed his reins to a waiting hand. At 38, he moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His face, weathered from sun and hardship, betrayed little emotion, but the ranch hands gave him a wide berth. They'd all heard the whispers in town, how Nathaniel Reed had built Blackwater Ranch from nothing after his parents' murder, how he'd killed 3 men to keep it, how he'd earned the name the Wolf of Colorado, not a man to cross. Inside, he poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass and stood by the window, watching lightning fracture the darkening sky. The house was too big for one man. 8 rooms of solid pine and stone that echoed with emptiness. His mother had designed it for a family that never had the chance to fill it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Frank entered, hat in hand, gray hair plastered to his head from the rain. "Doc's patching up those rustlers. Sheriff will come for them tomorrow." Nathaniel nodded. "Any serious damage?" "Nothing fatal. You're still the best shot in the territory." Frank paused. "But we've got bigger problems than Harrington's men. The water. Creek's lower than I've ever seen it. Another month without rain, and we'll lose half the herd." Frank removed his soaked coat. "Been looking at the maps. Only reliable water source within 20 miles is Mason Spring," Nathaniel finished. Yep, that year-round spring and timber stand on his north side would solve our problems. And word in town is, the bank's foreclosing on him in 2 weeks. $5,000 in debt. Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. Thomas Mason's land bordered his eastern pasture, smaller than Blackwater, but with something priceless. Water that never failed, even in the worst drought years. Mason was a good soldier, Frank continued. Got that rebel bullet in his leg at Gettysburg. Wife died 3 years back. Been downhill since then. The old foreman cleared his throat. He's got a daughter, Abigail. Been running the place since her mother passed. Tough as rawhide, that girl. Smart, too. What are you suggesting, Frank? The old man shrugged. 15 years is a long time to sleep in an empty bed, boss. Mason needs money. You need water and an air for all this. He gestured at the house around them. Sometimes business and pleasure can mix just fine. Marriage is a business transaction, Nathaniel said flatly. Wouldn't be the first time out here. Frank put his hat back on. And from what I hear, Harrington's been threatening Mason too. Telling him once the bank takes the land, he'll be there to snatch it up. Been making the girl uncomfortable whenever she's in town. Something cold settled in Nathaniel's chest. Harrington's obsession with controlling the region's water wasn't just business. It was personal. 15 years ago, James Harrington's father had been one of the land speculators who'd threatened Nathaniel's parents before their murder. Arrange a meeting with Mason, Nathaniel said, downing his whiskey. Tomorrow. Thomas Mason's farm had seen better days. The barn needed paint, the corral had broken rails, and the small house looked tired against the Colorado landscape. But Nathaniel noted the neat vegetable garden, the well-maintained tools, and the healthy horses. Someone was fighting hard to keep this place alive. As Nathaniel dismounted, the door opened. Abigail Mason stood on the porch, shotgun not quite pointed at him, but not quite pointed away either. 22 years old, with chestnut hair pulled back severely, and eyes that held too much hardship for someone so young. She wore men's work clothes, practical for ranch work, and her hands showed calluses that matched Nathaniel's own. Mr. Reed, she acknowledged coolly. Didn't expect the great cattle baron himself. Come to buy us out before the bank does? Nathaniel removed his hat. I've come to speak with your father, Miss Mason. He's inside. Bad day for his leg. Something protective flashed in her eyes. The war still pains him. Nathaniel nodded. The war between the states had left many men broken in body and spirit. May I come in? She stepped aside, shotgun still in hand. Smart girl. Inside, Thomas Mason sat by the fire, a blanket over his withered legs. Once a strong man, now hollowed out by grief and pain. His eyes, however, still held a soldier's alertness. Nathaniel Reed, he said, extending a trembling hand. Your father was a good man. Sorry about what happened to your folks. Nathaniel shook the offered hand. That was a long time ago. Not long enough to forget, I'd wager. Mason gestured to a chair. What brings you to our humble home? Come to make an offer before foreclosure. Abigail remained standing, her back against the wall, watching with suspicious eyes. I have a proposition, Nathaniel said, getting straight to business. Your land has what mine lacks, reliable water. Mine has what yours lacks, capital and manpower. Mason's eyes narrowed. Go on. I'll pay off your banknotes. $5,000, your debt wiped clean. You can live here for the rest of your days, comfortable, respected. And what do you get? Abigail cut in. Nathaniel turned to her, meeting her suspicious gaze directly. I get the water rights and a wife. The room went deadly silent. Thomas Mason's face paled. Abigail's knuckles whitened around the shotgun. You can't be serious, she finally managed. I'm always serious about business, Miss Mason. And this is business. Nathaniel stood, placing his hat back on. Your father keeps his home and dignity. You secure his future. I get the water that will save Blackwater Ranch. And if we refuse, Abigail challenged, then in 2 weeks, James Harrington buys this land from the bank, and you both have nothing. He's made it clear that's his intention. A look of genuine fear crossed Mason's face at Harrington's name. Harrington's been sniffing around here since Catherine died, made threats when I wouldn't sell to him directly. What kind of threats? Nathaniel asked sharply. Mason looked away. Said accidents happen to stubborn old men. Said my daughter might find herself in uncomfortable situations. Abigail's jaw tightened, but Nathaniel caught the flash of remembered fear in her eyes. My offer stands until the bank's deadline, Nathaniel said, voice softer now. Think it over. This doesn't have to be unpleasant. We would be partners in a business venture, nothing more. As he walked to his horse, Abigail's furious footsteps followed him into the yard. I am not cattle to be traded, Mr. Reed, she hissed, rain beginning to fall again, plastering her shirt to her shoulders. Nathaniel mounted his stallion, looking down at her flushed face. No, Miss Mason, cattle I would simply buy. You I'm offering to marry, with all the legal protections and social standing that entails. He gathered the reins. And unlike Harrington, I keep my word. Ask anyone. With that, he rode away, feeling her burning gaze on his back all the way to the property line. The wedding took place in the Blackwater Ranch house 3 days before the bank's deadline. No guests, no celebrations, just the justice of the peace, Frank as witness and Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, openly crying despite her usual stern demeanor. Abigail wore a simple blue dress, her only concession to the occasion. She spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, but her eyes never softened. When the justice pronounced them man and wife, Nathaniel barely brushed his lips against hers. A business transaction completed. Mrs. Holloway will show you to your room, Nathaniel said as they signed the marriage certificate. Your belongings have been brought over. Abigail raised an eyebrow. My room? Not ours? This is a business arrangement, Mrs. Reed. I respect that fact, even if you don't yet believe it. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps even a reluctant appreciation. Your father can move in whenever he wishes, Nathaniel continued. The east cabin has been prepared for him. Ground floor, no stairs to manage with his leg. Abigail's posture remained rigid, but her voice softened slightly. Thank you for that consideration, Nathaniel nodded. Dinner is at 6. I have work to attend to. As he strode out to the stables, Nathaniel felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. The water rights were secured. Blackwater would survive the drought. Yet something about Abigail Mason's, no, Reed's, defiant stance stirred something he'd thought long buried. She was nothing like the docile town women who simpered in his presence. She had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. This would be an interesting partnership, indeed. Abigail spent her first week at Blackwater Ranch observing everything. The operation was impressive. 30 hands, 500 cattle, 20 horses, and 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Colorado. Nathaniel ran it with military precision, up before dawn and working alongside his men, expecting excellence but never demanding what he wouldn't do himself. On her 8th day, Abigail was exploring the stables when 3 riders approached, none wearing Blackwater's brand. The lead rider, a slick-haired man with an expensive suit and cold eyes, dismounted and looked her over with undisguised interest. Well, well, you must be Reed's new acquisition. The water rights with a woman attached. His smile never reached his eyes. James Harrington, ma'am, your neighbor to the north. Abigail stiffened. So this was Harrington, the man who'd threatened her father, who'd made her feel unsafe in town with his lingering glances and accidental touches. Mrs. Reed, she corrected, deliberately emphasizing her new name. Harrington laughed. Of course. Tell me, Mrs. Reed, Does your husband treat you as property like everything else he owns? Or has he not yet exercised his rights? The lewd implication made her skin crawl. His hand reached out as if to touch her cheek. Mr. Harrington. Nathaniel's voice came from behind her, deadly quiet. He emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, though not yet raised. You're trespassing. Just welcoming the new bride to the neighborhood, Harrington said smoothly. Such a productive merger. The Mason water rights must be worth a fortune in this drought. Nathaniel's eyes had gone cold as winter. Say another word about my wife, and they'll find pieces of you across 3 counties. For a moment, tension crackled between the men like lightning. Abigail saw Nathaniel's finger twitch toward the trigger, saw real, barely contained violence in his stance. For the first time, she believed the stories about the Wolf of Colorado. Harrington must have seen it too. His smile faltered. No offense intended. He mounted his horse. Just remember, Reed, everything has a price, even Blackwater Ranch. With that, he and his men rode off. Nathaniel watched until they disappeared over the ridge, his face a rigid mask. When he turned to Abigail, something in his expression had changed. Are you all right? He asked, his voice rough with contained anger. I'm fine. I've dealt with Harrington before. She hesitated. He's been making threats against my father for years. After my mother died, he'd come around, making offers that got lower each time. When we refused, things would happen. Fence posts cut, chicken coop vandalized. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell me this before? Would it have changed anything? Abigail challenged. We needed the money. You needed the water. The arrangement stands regardless. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Come with me, he said finally. Curious despite herself, Abigail followed him to a locked room off the library. Inside was a simple desk, atop which lay an old leather-bound journal. My mother's, Nathaniel explained, lifting it carefully. Read it if you wish. It might help you understand why Blackwater is worth killing for, and why Harrington will never have it while I draw breath. He left her alone with the journal, closing the door softly behind him. That night by lamplight, Abigail read Sarah Reed's elegant handwriting, chronicling the family's journey west, the building of Blackwater from wilderness, and their constant struggles against drought, disease, and men who coveted their land. The final entry, written the day before the Reeds were murdered, spoke of threats from land speculators, men who would later form the core of Harrington's empire. I fear what will become of our Nathaniel if anything happens to us, Sarah had written. At 19, he carries the weight of a man twice his age. This land has shaped him, hardened him in ways that pain a mother's heart. I pray it has not hardened him beyond redemption. Abigail closed the journal, understanding dawning. The next morning at breakfast, she found Nathaniel already at the table, reviewing cattle tallies. Your mother loved this land, she said quietly. Nathaniel looked up, surprise flickering across his features. She did. And she worried about what it was doing to you. His jaw tightened. She worried about everything. With good reason, it seems. Abigail sat across from him. Harrington's family was behind your parents' murder. I could never prove it. Nathaniel's voice was flat. But yes. Is that why you need this marriage? Not just for water, but for an heir to continue the fight? Nathaniel met her gaze. I built Blackwater from the ashes of my family's murder. 15 years of blood and sweat. I won't let it die with me. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding beyond words. For the first time, Abigail saw beneath the hard exterior to the burning purpose that drove Nathaniel Reed. Not greed, not power, but a promise to the dead. Before she could respond, Frank burst into the room, his weathered face grave. Boss, riders coming in fast from the north fence. 20 men at least, armed. Harrington's flying his brand like a damn battle flag. Nathaniel was on his feet instantly. Get the men ready. Rifles, ammunition. He turned to Abigail. Stay in the house. Mrs. Holloway knows where the shotguns are kept. Abigail stood. I can shoot as well as any of your men. My father made sure of it after what happened to my mother. What happened to your mother? Nathaniel asked sharply. She wasn't killed by influenza like everyone thinks, Abigail said, her voice tight. She was coming back from town alone. Two men stopped her wagon. She swallowed hard. They hurt her badly. She died 3 days later. Father recognized one of them as Harrington's foreman, but the sheriff wouldn't touch Harrington's men. Nathaniel's face darkened with cold fury. Frank, he called, never taking his eyes from Abigail's face, give Mrs. Reed a Winchester. She covers the house with Mrs. Holloway. As the men prepared, Abigail felt fear knotting her stomach, not for herself, but for her father, still at the old homestead, vulnerable if this was a coordinated attack. She caught Nathaniel's arm as he checked his gun belt. My father. I sent 2 men to bring him here at dawn. Nathaniel interrupted. They should arrive within the hour. The simple act of foresight, of protecting her father without being asked, caught Abigail off guard. Before she could respond, gunfire erupted from the north pasture. The battle for Blackwater had begun. Harrington's men hit the north fence line first, driving stolen Blackwater cattle before them to create confusion. As Nathaniel and his hands returned fire from behind hastily formed barricades, 3 riders broke off, heading for the ranch house itself. From her position at an upstairs window, Abigail tracked the approaching riders through her rifle sights. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12. A woman alone needs to protect herself, he'd said after her mother died. She'd never imagined using those skills like this. The lead rider raised a torch, aiming for the barn roof. Abigail steadied her breath, just as her father had taught her. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder as the .44-40 round found its mark. The man tumbled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Not dead. She'd aimed for his shoulder, but definitely no longer a threat. The other riders pulled up short, suddenly aware of the danger from above. Abigail worked the lever smoothly, chambering another round. That's close enough, gentlemen, she called out. The next one won't be so merciful. The riders retreated, abandoning their fallen comrade. From the pasture, more gunfire, then an eerie silence. Minutes stretched like hours until finally, riders approached again. This time, Nathaniel and his men, with 4 bound prisoners across their saddles. One of Nathaniel's hands was wounded, clutching a bloodied arm. Abigail rushed downstairs as they dismounted. Harrington? She asked. Escaped, Nathaniel replied grimly, his own sleeve torn and stained with blood. But we caught his foreman and 3 others. Enough to bring charges this time. He turned to Frank. Get Doc Miller for Reynolds here and send word to the sheriff. Only when the wounded were being tended and the prisoners secured did Nathaniel acknowledge his own injury. A bullet grazed across his upper arm. Abigail insisted on cleaning it herself, working silently in the kitchen while Mrs. Holloway prepared coffee for the exhausted men. You're handy with a rifle, Nathaniel said finally, wincing as she applied carbolic acid to the wound. My father taught me after what happened to my mother. Said a woman should know how to protect herself. He taught you well. There was new respect in his voice. That shot saved the barn, maybe the whole ranch. I was protecting my investment, Abigail replied, but the edge had gone from her voice. Nathaniel's hand caught hers as she finished bandaging his arm. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle. Thank you. 2 simple words, yet they shifted something fundamental between them. No longer just a business transaction, but the beginning of a partnership forged in gunfire. The sound of hooves interrupted the moment. Thomas Mason had arrived, his weathered face tight with worry until he spotted his daughter. "Abigail, when I heard gunfire," he embraced her fiercely, then turned to Nathaniel. "I understand I have you to thank for sending men to fetch me." Nathaniel shook his head. "Family protects family, Mr. Mason. That's the Blackwater way." The word family hung in the air, new and untested. Thomas looked between his daughter and his new son-in-law, sensing the subtle change between them. "Well," he said finally, "seems I chose better for my girl than I knew." The weeks following the attack brought changes to Blackwater Ranch. The sheriff arrested Harrington for organized rustling and attempted arson, though everyone knew his money would eventually free him. Thomas Mason settled into the east cabin, his spirits lifting as he took charge of the vegetable gardens and chicken coops. Small responsibilities that restored his sense of purpose. And between Nathaniel and Abigail, something unspoken was growing. They still slept in separate rooms, maintained their careful distance, but their conversations over dinner stretched longer each night. They discovered shared interests in books and music. Nathaniel began seeking her opinion on ranch matters, finding her insights valuable. One evening, as summer heat gave way to autumn crispness, Abigail found Nathaniel in the stables, examining a mare about to foal. "Frank says she's having trouble," Abigail said, approaching cautiously. Nathaniel nodded, face grave. "Breech birth. We might lose them both." Without being asked, Abigail rolled up her sleeves. "My mother was a midwife before she married. Some things translate across species." Together they worked through the night, guiding the struggling foal into the world. When the tiny creature finally drew breath, both Nathaniel and Abigail were splattered with blood and sweat, exhausted but triumphant. "Life finds a way," Abigail murmured, watching the foal nurse for the first time. Nathaniel looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her anew. "You never cease to surprise me, Abigail Reed." The use of her married name, spoken not as a business title but with genuine admiration, warmed her unexpectedly. "The feeling is mutual," she admitted. "When I agreed to this marriage, I thought I knew exactly who Nathaniel Reed was, the cold-blooded wolf of Colorado. And now," she met his gaze steadily, "now I see a man who would die protecting what he loves, who sends men to guard an old soldier he barely knows, who stays up all night to save a foal that any businessman would write off as a loss." Something changed in Nathaniel's eyes, a vulnerability she'd never glimpsed before. "I built these walls for a reason, Abigail," he said quietly, "letting people in. It's not something I do easily." "I've noticed," her smile softened the words, "but perhaps it's time we both acknowledge that this marriage has become more than a water rights agreement." The distance between them seemed to shrink, the stable air suddenly charged with possibility. Nathaniel reached out, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Perhaps it has." When his lips met hers, there was nothing businesslike in the contact, only the tentative exploration of two people discovering that what had begun as necessity might become something far more valuable. 6 weeks later, word came that Harrington had posted bail, an astronomical sum that proved the extent of his connections. The trial was still months away, but he was free to move about the territory, though prohibited from approaching Blackwater Ranch. "He won't stay away," Frank predicted grimly as they discussed the news over dinner. "Not Harrington." Nathaniel's hand tightened on his fork. "Let him come. This time I'll be ready." That night, unable to sleep, Abigail found herself drawn to Nathaniel's door. Their relationship had changed since that night in the stable, but they'd moved slowly, cautiously, each still maintaining separate bedrooms despite sharing increasingly intimate moments. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. From inside came a sound that stopped her cold, the unmistakable metallic click of a revolver being loaded. She pushed the door open without knocking. Nathaniel sat on the edge of his bed, his Colt peacemaker in hand, methodically loading each chamber. Nathaniel? He looked up, not startled, as if he'd sensed her presence. Harrington won't wait for the trial. He'll come for me. For us. Tonight I ride out to meet him. Abigail crossed the room in 3 strides. That's suicide. It's necessary. 15 years, Abigail. 15 years I've been fighting the same battle against men who want to take what isn't theirs. It ends tonight. His eyes held a cold determination she hadn't seen before. And if you die, what happens to Blackwater then? To my father? She knelt before him, hands covering his. To me? Nathaniel stared at her, conflict warring in his eyes. I can't live waiting for him to strike. That's no life. And murder is? Her voice softened. The law has him now, Nathaniel. Let it work. The law failed my parents, failed your mother. Then we fight him together, legally, properly. She took the gun from his hands. You're not alone anymore. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a sigh that seemed to release 15 years of solitary vigilance, Nathaniel nodded. Together, he agreed. That night, Abigail stayed, not out of fear or obligation, but choice. And in the quiet darkness, what had begun as a business transaction transformed completely into a true marriage. Harrington's trial came in early winter. The courthouse packed with spectators eager to see the powerful rancher brought low. The evidence was overwhelming. 4 of his own men testifying against him in exchange for reduced sentences. As Nathaniel and Abigail entered the courthouse, whispers followed them. The notorious loner in the headstrong Mason girl had become the territory's most unexpected couple. Rumors swirled about how she'd shot a man to protect Blackwater, how they'd fought side by side. The prosecutor presented his case methodically: rustling, attempted arson, conspiracy to commit murder. Harrington's expensive lawyer argued technicalities, but the jury's expressions told the tale. During a recess, Harrington approached where Nathaniel and Abigail sat conferring with their lawyer. "You've won this round, Reed," he said, voice low enough that only they could hear. "But a man like me doesn't stay down long. When I get out, and I will get out, I'll remember who put me there." Nathaniel stood slowly, his hand brushing his gun belt in a movement so subtle only those looking for it would notice. 15 years ago, I would have put a bullet in you without hesitation, he said, voice deadly quiet. Consider it growth that I'm letting the law handle you instead. Harrington's eyes narrowed. You've gone soft, Reed. Found yourself a wife and suddenly you're civilized? He smirked at Abigail. Wonder how long that'll last when... He never finished the sentence. Nathaniel's hand shot out, grabbing Harrington's collar and yanking him close. Threaten my wife again, and they'll never find your body. Each word fell like a hammer blow. That's not a threat. It's a simple fact of nature. The bailiff separated them, but the damage was done. The jury had witnessed Harrington's intimidation attempt. By day's end, the verdict was in. Guilty on all counts. 15 years in territorial prison. As they left the courthouse, Abigail slipped her hand into Nathaniel's, a public acknowledgement of their changing relationship that didn't escape notice. You meant what you said in there, she observed as they rode home through the winter landscape. About letting the law handle things now. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his breath fogging in the cold air. 15 years ago, I lived for vengeance. It kept me warm at night, gave purpose to each day. But now, he looked at her, winter sunlight catching in his eyes. Now I find I have something to live for, not just against. Spring came early to Colorado, bringing new grass and new life to Blackwater Ranch. The creek ran full with snowmelt, the cattle grew fat on fresh pasture, and Thomas Mason's gardens exploded with color and produce. One morning, as dawn painted the mountains gold, Abigail found Nathaniel at his desk, reviewing plans for an irrigation system that would connect the Mason Spring to Blackwater's main pastures. "You've been working on this for weeks," she observed, placing coffee beside him. "Water security means everything out here." He looked up at her. "This will be Blackwater's legacy, drought-proof grazing that will sustain generations." "Generations?" Abigail raised an eyebrow. "That's quite ambitious." Nathaniel stood, taking her hands in his. "I've been thinking about that, about the future." His usually steady voice held a note of uncertainty. "When we married, it was a business arrangement. But now it's more." Abigail finished for him. "Much more." His eyes searched hers. "I find myself wanting those generations to be real, wanting children to inherit this land. Our children." Abigail's smile bloomed slowly. "I was wondering when you'd bring that up. You've thought about it? About building a family with the most stubborn, honorable man I've ever known?" Her hand rested on his chest, feeling his heartbeat. "I think we've already started." Understanding dawned in Nathaniel's eyes. "You're—" She nodded. "Doc confirmed it yesterday. By Christmas, Blackwater will have its heir." Nathaniel Reed, the feared wolf of Colorado, the man who had faced down killers without flinching, found himself speechless. When he finally pulled Abigail into his arms, his whispered "thank you" carried the weight of 15 years of solitude finally ended. The winter winds howled outside, but inside the Blackwater Ranch house, warmth and life prevailed. In the master bedroom, Nathaniel sat beside the bed where Abigail cradled their newborn son, exhausted but triumphant after 18 hours of labor. "He has your eyes," Nathaniel said, voice hushed with wonder as he stared at the tiny face peering up at him. "What shall we call him?" "William," Abigail said softly. "William Thomas Reed. After your father and mine." Nathaniel nodded, throat tight with emotion. "William Thomas Reed," he repeated, "heir to Blackwater Ranch." A knock at the door announced Thomas Mason, who entered leaning heavily on his cane, face alight with joy at the sight of his grandson. Mrs. Holloway followed with a tray of food, and Frank stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand, grinning like a fool. "Fine-looking boy," the old foreman declared. "Got the Reed jawline already." As the small family celebrated the new arrival, Nathaniel found himself standing by the window, watching snow swirl against the dark glass. 15 years ago, he'd stood alone in this same spot, 19 years old, orphaned and vengeful, swearing to build something that would last. Now that vow had taken form in ways he could never have imagined, not just in land and cattle and buildings, but in people, in family. Abigail caught his eye from across the room, understanding his thoughts as she'd learned to do. She gave him a small, private smile that warmed him more than any fire could. Later that night, with the house quiet and their son finally sleeping, Nathaniel sat on the edge of their bed, his father's pocket watch in his hand. "I've been saving this," he told Abigail, "for the day when Blackwater finally had its future secured." "And now?" she asked, reaching for his hand. "Now I understand what my mother meant in her final journal entry about landshaping a man." He looked down at their sleeping son. "She was right to worry. This place had hardened me, made me something I wasn't proud of. But you," he squeezed her fingers gently, "you brought me back." "We saved each other," Abigail corrected softly. "You gave me and my father a home when we had nothing. I gave you a family when you'd forgotten what that meant." Outside, the wind changed direction. No longer howling but singing around the eaves of the house Nathaniel's parents had built for a future they never saw. "A man can fight his whole life," Nathaniel said quietly, "and never know what he's really fighting for until it's staring him in the face." He placed the watch on the bedside table, where one day it would pass to his son, along with the land and the legacy, not just of struggle and survival, but of redemption, of the hard man who had learned to love again. I spent 15 years being the wolf, he murmured, drawing Abigail close. Now it's time to be something else. And what's that? She asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Nathaniel Reed, once the most feared and isolated man in the territory, smiled as his son's tiny fingers closed around his weathered thumb. A father, he said simply, a husband. A man with something to protect, not just something to avenge. The storms would come again. They always did in this harsh, beautiful land. But now Nathaniel Reed would weather them with family by his side, with roots that ran deeper than business, deeper than water rights, deeper even than the blood that had been spilled to keep this land. Some men are shaped by storms, hardened by their fury. The wisest learn that even the hardest man can be softened by the right hands, hands that build rather than destroy, that heal rather than harm, that reach out across the distances we create in our fear of being wounded again. And Nathaniel Reed, against all odds and his own expectations, had become just such a man.